the first thing you notice is the sound. Not the roar of gladiators in an arena, not the triumphant blast of brass trumpets echoing through marble colonnades, but something quieter, the steady creak of a wooden wheel as a mule-drawn cart rolls over cobblestones, slick from the night's mist, the low hum of voices, traders setting up their stalls along the forum's edges, mothers calling to sleepy children, a baker humming as he feeds wood into the belly of his oven. It is dawn in Rome. The sun has barely touched the rooftops of the city, but the smell of baking bread is already curling through the narrow streets, mixing with the sharper tang of fish unloaded from the river docks. The air feels cool now, but it won't stay that way. By midday, the stone will have soaked in the sun's heat, and these cramped lanes will hold it like an oven. You stand at the corner of a street in the Subura district, the beating heart of Rome's working class. Above you, the insulae, the multi-story wooden apartment blocks, loom like drunken giants, leaning ever so slightly, as if conspiring to topple. From open windows, lines of laundry sway lazily, dripping water onto the heads of passers-by. You shift to avoid a splash, but it's too late. You're already damp, and the day has barely begun. Around you, the city is waking. A boy shuffles past, balancing a basket of vegetables, his tunic slipping off one shoulder. A group of laborers trudge by, ropes looped over their shoulders, heading for the docks. Somewhere close, the metallic clang of a blacksmith's hammer rings out in measured rhythm. It is beautiful in a way, but it is also clear that you are no patrician. You wear a plain wool tunic, patched at the elbows, dyed in a shade of brown that hides dirt more than it catches the eye. No embroidered border, no fine clasp to mark wealth or position. Here, in ancient Rome, that means everyone knows exactly what you are. No one of importance, and that changes everything. You are not welcome everywhere. You cannot walk through certain gates unchallenged. You cannot sit in certain seats at the theater. If a soldier strikes you in the street, there will be no hearing, no justice, because your word will never carry the same weight as someone of higher rank. Even now, as you step forward into the bustle, a man in a fine white toga, edged with purple passes, his attendants pushing people aside to clear his way. You step back automatically. If you didn't, the shove would come harder, and it wouldn't matter if you fell in the street. No one would stop to help you. The marble columns, the wide public baths, the grand temples, they are not for you. Your Rome is narrower, louder, and infinitely more dangerous. And so, in this quiet moment, before the chaos of the day truly begins, you take in the city around you, both magnificent and merciless, and realize that surviving here, without status, will require more than strength. It will demand cunning, submission, and a constant awareness of your place in the order of things. Before we begin, before we walk into this world together, let's take a small pause. Settle into your seat or your bed, wherever you happen to be. Feel the weight of your body ease, and your breath find a steady rhythm. Before you settle in too far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating to see the little constellation of listeners scattered across the world. Now, let's step forward into Rome. Not the Rome of emperors and poets, but the Rome of cart pushers, dockhands, and washerwomen. The Rome where one wrong glance, one ill-chosen word, could mean your end. We will walk its streets together, smell its air, and feel its weight, not from the safety of a marble villa, but from the ground where survival is anything but certain. And by the end, you might just understand why. Without status, you wouldn't last a day here. If you close your eyes and picture ancient Rome, you might see something out of a grand mosaic, polished marble steps gleaming in the sun, men in flowing togas debating in the forum, vast colonnades where shadows stretch across cool stone floors, a feast table so long it could pass for a road, piled with figs, olives, and roasted meats, the air scented with wine, rosemary, and perfumed oil. That Rome existed, but it was not your Rome. For most people, especially those without a title, a patron, or even a family name worth whispering, Rome was a different city altogether. It was a place of smoke and dust, of alleys so tight 2 carts could never pass each other, of shouting hawkers, dripping laundry, and the constant shuffle of tired feet, of smells that clung to your skin, sweat, rotting vegetables, the sour tang of spilled wine, the stink of sewage running in shallow gutters down the street. Your Rome was a patchwork of hardship and noise. You didn't debate in the forum. You avoided it, because the men there weren't listening for voices like yours. You didn't stroll the marble steps of the baths at midday. You queued for hours for the smaller, grimier pools, where the water was reused until it turned cloudy and warm. The postcard version of Rome skips the fact that the city could be cruel to anyone without power. The law was not blind. It saw you very clearly and decided you weren't worth protecting. A rich man could have you beaten for an imagined insult, and no court would take your side. A merchant could shortchange you, and there'd be no magistrate willing to hear your complaint. And yet, this wasn't just about the absence of protection. It was the daily grind of navigating a world that made sure you never forgot your place. You stood back to let the wealthy pass in the street. You lowered your eyes in the presence of certain officials. You learned to keep your voice low, your words agreeable, your ambitions invisible. Without status, survival meant staying unnoticed until you couldn't, and then hoping you were quick enough to slip away before trouble found you. Imagine arriving here, fresh from the comfort of your own life, and thinking you could last even a single day. You'd be hungry before noon. Your purse, if you had one, might be cut from your belt before sunset. And by nightfall, if you wandered too far from your neighborhood, you could disappear into the shadows for good. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk through that single day together. We'll start with the hierarchy that defined who you were and what you could do. We'll climb the creaking stairs of the insulae, where families packed themselves into rooms barely wider than a bed. We'll stand in the queues for bread, shoulder to shoulder with the city's desperate and weary. We'll watch the justice system from the wrong side of its iron teeth. Rome could be beautiful, yes, but beauty was a luxury you could not afford without status. And once you see it from the ground up, you'll understand why your chances here, stripped of protection, would be measured in hours, not days. The moment you step into Rome, you're already placed somewhere on its invisible ladder. It doesn't matter how clever you are, how strong you might be, or even how much coin you've tucked away in your belt. In Rome, the measure of a person isn't written in muscle or wit. It's carved in marble somewhere, inscribed in old laws, and whispered in the daily rituals that govern every street corner. At the top are the patricians, the old families whose names open every door before they even knock. Below them, the equestrians, the moneyed class who could afford fine horses and use them as symbols of their standing. Then come the plebeians, the vast majority of citizens, ordinary workers, artisans, farmers, traders, who might own little more than their tools and a few sets of clothes. And beneath them, the freedmen, former slaves who'd bought or been granted their liberty, but still carried the shadow of their past servitude. At the very bottom, slaves, the living property of others, who could be traded, punished, or discarded without recourse. If you're standing here without title, without patronage, and without family prestige, you are not much more than a number in this teeming crowd. In the eyes of the elite, you are a background figure, someone to fetch water, sweep floors, or shift crates. This wasn't just about bragging rights or pride. Status in Rome determined almost every aspect of your life, where you lived, what you wore, how you ate, and whether anyone would listen if you cried out for help. It even governed movement. A patrician could cross the forum wearing a toga with a purple stripe, and the crowd would part for him as though he were a moving wall. You, in your plain wool tunic, would be brushed aside without apology, or worse, ignored entirely and knocked to the ground. If you dared to walk into a senator's reception without invitation, you'd be turned out before you could even speak. And if you attempted to join a gathering reserved for the elite, you might be accused of disrespecting the social order, a dangerous charge in a city where justice leaned heavily toward the powerful. The truth is, without status in ancient Rome, you lived your life in the shadows of others, sometimes literally. The city's architecture told the story. The sunlit marble porticos belonged to the wealthy. The rest of you found yourselves in narrow, dark alleys between tenement walls, where the breeze barely reached and daylight was something you glimpsed, not basked in. And the most suffocating part, There was no easy climbing of this ladder. Your birth stamped you with an invisible seal that followed you everywhere. Even if you worked hard enough to earn some wealth, without the right connections, you'd still be locked out of the places where real power lived. In Rome, you didn't need to speak for someone to know exactly who and what you were. Your clothing did the talking, long before you opened your mouth. Every thread, every color, every fold told a story, and for someone without status, it was rarely a flattering one. The wealthy draped themselves in fabrics that seemed to glow in the sunlight. Fine white wool bleached to perfection, smooth linen imported from Egypt, and silk so light it clung like mist to the skin. Borders and stripes signaled rank. The broad purple band of a senator's toga, the narrower stripe of an equestrian, both impossible to miss against the snowy folds. Even the sandals on their feet could whisper wealth, soft leather dyed in rich tones, stitched by craftsmen whose work was almost art. And then there was you. A plain wool tunic, rough to the touch, dyed in whatever earthy tone could be coaxed from inexpensive plants. Brown, muddy red, faded green. If you were lucky, it had been patched neatly. If not, the repairs stood out like scars. No purple stripe, no fine clasp, no ornamentation that might hint at influence. Your sandals, if you owned any, were thick, cracked leather, the straps worn soft with years of use. It wasn't just about comfort or appearance. In Rome, your clothing was a badge of identity, and wearing something above your station was more than presumptuous. It was risky. The wrong outfit could get you questioned, insulted, or even beaten. If a soldier or official suspected you were dressing above your rank, they might accuse you of trying to impersonate someone of importance, a charge that could carry legal consequences. Even cleanliness spoke volumes. Wealthier Romans could send their garments to be cleaned in urine-filled vats at the Phalanike, where slaves stomped the cloth until it was spotless and bright. You, without the coin for such services, washed your tunic in a bucket, scrubbing until your hands ached, knowing it would never quite look new again. By midday, the dust of Rome's streets, kicked up by carts, mules, and thousands of sandals, would cling to the fabric anyway. Hair was another silent proclamation. A nobleman might have his hair trimmed and beard shaved daily by a personal barber. Your hair, however, was cut whenever a friend with a sharp knife had the time, and the uneven result was its own kind of public announcement. And for women without status, the gap was even wider. A patrician woman might have her hair dressed in elaborate curls piled high and pinned with jeweled combs, her stola flowing in layers of fine fabric. You might own one serviceable tunic and a worn belt to cinch it, your hair tied back with a strip of cloth, because pins and combs cost more than a day's bread. It's easy to imagine walking into Rome and blending in, but clothing made that impossible. Even if you tried to dress like someone important, the fabric, the cut, the drape, it would all give you away. And in a city where your appearance determined how you were treated, blending in wasn't an option. You were visible, always, marked by the simple fact that you weren't worth marking at all. In ancient Rome, survival without status was rarely a solo endeavor. You could have strong arms, quick wit, and endless determination, but without someone above you offering protection, your chances of thriving, or even making it through the year, were slim. That protection came in the form of patronage. The system was as old as the city itself. At its heart was a simple, unspoken bargain. A patron, a wealthy, influential man, would extend his shield over you, and in return, you would serve him with loyalty and whatever usefulness you could muster. For the patron, this might mean political support, errands, small services, or simply swelling the crowd that greeted him in public. For you, it meant access to food, to work, to legal help when trouble inevitably came knocking. But the arrangement was never equal. Patronage was not friendship, it was hierarchy. You were expected to remember your place, to show respect, to speak with deference. If you offended your patron, or failed to be sufficiently grateful, you might find yourself out in the cold, literally overnight. Every morning in Rome, long before the day's work began, the salutatio took place. Clients, people like you, would gather outside their patron's home, sometimes in the dozens, sometimes in the hundreds, waiting to be received. You stood there in the early light, shifting on tired feet, perhaps still sore from the day before. When the doors opened, you stepped forward, offered your greeting, and if you were lucky, received your sportula, a small gift. Perhaps a basket of food, a few coins, or a promise of help with some minor legal matter. For some, this ritual was a lifeline. Without the sportula, there would be no bread for the evening meal, no money to pay the fuller to clean your only tunic, no help when a rival accused you of theft or insult. For others, it was a bitter humiliation, a daily reminder that in Rome, independence was a luxury few could afford, and patrons could be fickle. One day, you might be in his good graces. The next, you might be replaced by another client who bowed lower, spoke sweeter, or had some skill you couldn't match. Without a patron, doors that were once open would close so quickly it would feel like they'd never existed at all. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about safety. If a soldier accused you of a crime, or if a merchant claimed you owed him money, having a patron meant someone with influence could speak on your behalf. Without one, you were just another poor face in a crowded street. Easy to ignore, easier still to exploit. In a way, the system was a quiet form of control. By tying your survival to the goodwill of someone above you, Rome ensured you wouldn't bite the hand that fed you. And if you dreamed of climbing higher, of being more than someone else's client, well, that was the kind of ambition that could get you noticed. And in Rome, not all notice was the good kind. If you were without status in Rome, your home wasn't a marble villa with a shaded courtyard and a gentle fountain. It was far more likely to be a cramped room in an insula, one of the towering, precarious apartment blocks that crowded the poorer districts of the city. From a distance, they might look impressive. Rows of brick and timber stacked 4, 5, even 6 stories high, their walls painted in fading ochre and red. But step closer and you'd see the truth. The mortar was crumbling in places, the timber warped and bowed, the whole structure leaning like it had taken one too many blows. These weren't built for beauty or safety, they were built for profit. A landlord could cram dozens, sometimes hundreds of people into a single insula, charging rent for every room, every corner, every breath of space. Your room might be no larger than a small bedchamber, and that was for an entire family. There was no running water. If you needed to wash, you carried it up from the street or down from a cistern, slopping it into a clay jar in the corner. If you were lucky, you had a small window to let in light, but more often, the air inside was dim and stale, heavy with the smell of smoke from your neighbors' cooking fires. The insula were notorious fire traps. A single overturned lamp could send flames racing up the wooden staircases and across the timber floors faster than anyone could run. And when fire came, there was no organized firefighting for the poor. Wealthy districts had resources. Your district had buckets, panic, and prayers. Collapse was another constant fear. Cheap construction, overcrowding, and the shifting earth beneath Rome's streets meant that walls could give way without warning. When that happened, there was no compensation, no rebuilding fund, just rubble, dust, and the desperate scramble to salvage what little you owned. Noise was your constant companion, shouting hawkers below, clanging blacksmiths, the scrape of carts, the cries of street performers. Inside, you could hear every cough, every argument, every baby's wail through the thin walls. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the rich. In the insulae, your life was lived in the company of strangers' voices. And yet, for all their dangers, these buildings were home to the majority of Rome's population. If you had no status, no patron, and no wealth, this was where you belonged. You learned to sleep lightly, in case the floor shook in the night. You learned to keep your belongings packed in a way that could be carried quickly. And you learned, above all, not to expect permanence. Because in Rome, the walls around you were never as solid as they looked. Rome was famous for its aqueducts, great arches carrying fresh water across valleys and into the city, a marvel that people still admire today. But here's the thing, that clean flowing water was not flowing into your home. If you were without status, you collected your water from public fountains scattered around the city. Some mornings, the queue was already forming before the sun was high. Women with clay jars balanced on hips, children sent running with small pails, old men leaning on walking sticks while they waited their turn. The water was cold and fresh, yes, but it was also a shared resource, handled by dozens of hands before it ever touched your lips. You carried it up flights of narrow stairs to your insula, careful not to spill too much along the way, because every drop mattered. And then there was sanitation. Rome's public latrines were one of its most infamous institutions. Long stone benches with keyhole-shaped openings, arranged side by side without any partitions. Beneath them, A channel of running water carried waste away. Eventually, to the Tiber River. You might share the bench with strangers, sitting shoulder to shoulder, trying not to meet anyone's eye, while the sound and smell of the place wrapped around you. If you needed to clean yourself, you didn't have paper. You used a spongia, a stick with a sponge on the end, kept in a trough of vinegar water. And yes, it was shared. You learned to rinse it well before and after use, hoping the vinegar did its job. The wealthy, of course, didn't endure this. They had private latrines at home, sometimes even with marble seats, and their waste flushed away by water, piped directly from the aqueducts. But for you, sanitation was public, communal, and impossible to escape. Waste disposal was another challenge. In poorer districts, chamber pots were emptied into the gutters at night, their contents washing slowly down toward the main drains. Walking under the insulae after dark was dangerous, not just for crime, but for the very real risk of something unpleasant being dumped from a window above. Disease thrived in these conditions. Flies hovered over the drains, rats skittered through the alleys, and the combination of crowded living and poor sanitation meant fevers and stomach illnesses swept through entire neighborhoods with ease. A bad bout of dysentery could end a life in days, especially for children. So while Rome's aqueducts gleamed in the sunlight and its public baths made for impressive postcards in our imagination, your daily reality was one of queues, heavy jars, public benches, and a constant undercurrent of sickness. And you learned quickly, water in Rome was life, but it was also a reminder of just how far you stood from the marble comfort of the elite. When the sun dipped behind Rome's 7 hills, the city didn't fall silent, it changed. The heat of the day bled away, replaced by a cooler air that carried the mingled scents of charcoal smoke, baked bread gone stale, spilled wine, and the faint brine of the Tiber. The streets were still alive, but the tone had shifted. Daytime Rome belonged to merchants, laborers, and officials. Nighttime Rome belonged to shadows. The wealthy retreated behind thick walls and guarded gates, their villas glowing softly with lamplight, servants attending to their evening meals. You, without status, without a guard, remained outside in the warren of alleys and crowded tenements where the rules were different and far fewer. The city had no police in the modern sense. Yes, there were watchmen, vigils, but their main duties were fire control and basic night patrols in wealthier districts. In places like the Subura, where the poor were stacked in leaning insula, their presence was sporadic at best. If someone grabbed your purse, cornered you in an alley, or worse, you shouted for help and prayed someone close enough and brave enough would hear. The streets were dimly lit at best. Oil lamps flickered outside taverns and bathhouses, their flames throwing just enough light to deepen the shadows between them. The rest was lit by the moon if you were lucky, and the stars if the smoke and dust hadn't swallowed them. You learned to walk with purpose, eyes forward, hands close to your belt. Taverns spilled noise into the streets, dice games clattering on wooden tables, drunken laughter swelling into arguments, beggars huddled against walls, their bowls catching the occasional clink of a coin. Groups of men loitered in doorways, eyes following anyone who passed. Even the animals were different at night. Stray dogs prowled in silent packs, their shapes slipping in and out of the gloom. Rats darted across your path, bold in their search for scraps. And then there were the gangs. Some were loose bands of thieves. Others were muscle for hire, working for patrons who wanted their rivals intimidated or eliminated quietly. If you crossed the wrong path or lingered too long in the wrong place, you might find yourself in the middle of something that ended with your body floating in the Tiber by morning. For women without status, the dangers multiplied. Walking alone after dark could invite unwanted attention, and the city's narrow alleys offered no easy escape. Many learned to travel in pairs or stay indoors altogether once the lamps began to dim. Night in Rome was not a time for leisure if you were poor. It was a time to be careful, to keep your head down, and to remember that the dark didn't just hide you, it hid everyone else too. And so you learned to respect the shadows. You learned the quickest routes home, the alleys that offered cover, and the taverns where the owner might let you shelter until trouble passed. Because in Rome, after the sun set, survival wasn't about who you knew, it was about how quickly you could disappear. If you were without status in ancient Rome, Work wasn't something you chose. It was something you took because it was there. Because if you didn't, someone else would. And hunger would find you faster than you could talk yourself out of it. Your options depended on strength, luck, and who you happened to know. For many, it began at the docks. There, great ships unloaded their cargo, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, and it was the job of men like you to carry it, crate by crate, jar by jar, from the water's edge to the warehouses. The amphorae of oil were heavy, awkward things, their clay sides slick with condensation in the morning air. If you dropped one, the pay for the day might vanish along with the spilled oil, and so might your chance of getting hired again. If the docks weren't hiring, you might find work at a construction site. Rome was always building temples, aqueducts, baths, new housing for the wealthy, and every brick, every stone, every bucket of mortar had to be carried by human hands. You bent your back under the weight, your tunic sticking to your skin, dust filling your nose and throat until you could taste the day's labor. There were no helmets, no safety ropes, no guarantees that the scaffolding wouldn't give way beneath you. An accident was just that. Your problem, not your employer's. Some found work in the markets, hauling goods for merchants, or standing in the sun to hawk wares for a few copper coins. Others worked as street sweepers, pushing filth toward the gutters while avoiding the chamber pots emptied from above. And then there were the jobs no one wanted but someone had to do: tanning hides in pits of urine, cleaning public latrines, shoveling ash from the city's countless bakeries. Payment was low, and competition was fierce. Slaves worked for nothing more than their owner's command, so every job you wanted had to justify paying a free man when a slave could do it for less, or for nothing. And if work was scarce, you might stand in the labor market from dawn to noon, waiting for someone to call your name, only to walk home empty-handed. There was no steady wage, no guaranteed income. A single day without work could mean a smaller meal. Several days could mean no meal at all, and still, you worked, because the alternative was worse. In Rome, idleness wasn't leisure for the poor, it was danger. The city had little patience for the jobless, and without a patron to vouch for you, too many idle days could make you look like a criminal in waiting. Better to sweat in the sun than draw the wrong kind of attention. By the end of the day, your shoulders ached, your hands were raw, and your sandals, if you had them, were caked in dust and filth. You returned to your insula, knowing that tomorrow would be much the same, and that this cycle wasn't something you could work your way out of. It was survival on a short leash. If you were without status in ancient Rome, every meal was a question mark. Not a question of what to eat. Luxury didn't enter into it. But if there would be enough to fill your stomach before nightfall. For many, the cornerstone of survival was the grain dole, known as the annona. Each month, certain citizens could collect a measured portion of grain, enough, in theory, to keep a family from starvation. It wasn't bread yet. You still had to grind it, mix it, and bake it yourself, or pay someone else to do it. And there was always the risk of delay. A bad harvest in Egypt, a storm that kept ships from docking, or simple political maneuvering could reduce your portion or cancel it altogether. On days when the dole fell short, you relied on the cheapest food Rome could offer. The public bakeries sold coarse bread, dense and heavy, made from grain ground between rough stones that left flecks of grit in every bite. You chewed it slowly, feeling the crunch of stone dust between your teeth, knowing it wore them down long before age would. Porridge, pulse, was another staple. It was barley or millet boiled until soft, sometimes salted, occasionally flavored with a splash of oil if you could spare it. For a rare treat, you might add chopped leeks, onions, or a scattering of herbs. Meat was a luxury, appearing only in scraps, often from parts no one else wanted. Offal, bones for broth, bits of fat cut from a butcher's block. Fish, when you could afford it, was usually salted and dried. Fresh fish was expensive unless you lived near the docks and knew someone willing to part with the day's leftovers. Even then, it had to be eaten quickly. Rome's sun didn't forgive those who left food to linger. If you had a few extra coins, the street vendors called to you as you passed. They sold bowls of chickpeas, stewed in garlic, skewers of grilled sausage, pastries stuffed with cheese or dates. But more often, you walked by, letting the smell fill your lungs instead of your belly. Wine, too, was part of the diet. but not the rich, full-bodied wines of the elite. Yours was thin, watered down, sometimes soured. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about safety. Water could make you sick. Even cheap wine could kill the taste of what floated in it. Hunger was never far away. A bad week of work meant smaller portions, more watered porridge, and the gnawing ache in your stomach as you tried to sleep. In Rome, without status, meals were less about dining and more about enduring. And still, there were moments of small joy. A piece of honeycomb bought from a market stall. A fig split between friends. The rich smell of bread when it came fresh from the oven. They were brief, but they reminded you that even in the hardest corners of the city, life had its pockets of sweetness. In ancient Rome, without status, your health was always walking a thin edge. One slip on a wet cobblestone, one deep cut from a chisel, one bad cup of water, and the difference between recovery and ruin could come down to who you knew and what you could pay. The wealthy had physicians, some Greek-trained, others learned through years of practice, who could come to their homes with clean instruments, rare herbs, and enough privacy for rest. You, on the other hand, relied on what the streets could give you. If you were sick or injured, the first step was often the market stalls. Here, you could find herbs and poultices sold by herbalists who learned their craft from mothers and grandmothers, passing down recipes in quiet whispers. There was rosemary for the stomach, garlic for strength, poppy for pain if you could afford it. But no matter how skilled, these remedies were limited. An infected wound might be washed with wine if you had any to spare, but more often it was wrapped in cloth and left to fate. There were Medici doctors who served the public, but they were few, and their time was rarely free. If you couldn't pay, you might barter, labor for treatment, food for medicine. But the truth was, many didn't seek help at all, either because they couldn't afford it or because the risk of leaving home sick was worse than staying in bed. Injury on the job was common, and there was no compensation, no sick pay, no guild safety net for the poor. A broken arm could mean weeks without work, and weeks without work meant weeks without food. Some men went back to work before they'd healed, limping through the docks or hauling bricks with a half-mended shoulder, because the alternative was hunger. A cough in one family could echo through the whole building within days. Fever, stomach illness, and infections claimed more lives than the sword or the arena, and with no clear understanding of germs, prevention was more superstition than science. Some prayed to Asclepius, the god of healing, or left offerings at his temple, hoping divine favor would succeed where herbs failed. Others turned to charms, bits of bone, carved stones, whispered incantations to ward off sickness. Faith, in many ways, was the last medicine available when the body began to fail, and perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. In Rome, without status, you didn't just live closer to danger, you lived closer to death. A wealthy man could recover from an illness that would end the life of a laborer, not because the disease was different, but because his bed was softer, his food richer, his water cleaner, and his physician close at hand. For you, there was no such safety net, just hope, grit, and the silent understanding that a bad turn of health might be your last. In the marble halls of Rome's law courts, justice wore a white toga and a blindfold only when it suited her. If you were without status, the law didn't shield you. It watched you, measured you, and often found you wanting. Rome prided itself on its legal system. There were laws for contracts, laws for property, laws for inheritance, laws for crimes both great and small. In theory, every free citizen had the right to a trial. In practice, the weight of your words in court depended less on truth and more on who you were, and more importantly, who you knew. A wealthy man could afford skilled advocates to speak on his behalf, men trained in rhetoric who could turn the tide of a case with carefully chosen words. You, without coin, might be lucky to find a friend willing to stand beside you, someone whose speech was honest but plain, without the flourish that swayed judges and crowds. Even the process itself was daunting. To bring a case, you needed to know the right procedure, file the right forms, and if you wanted any hope of winning, grease the right palms. Fail to do so, and your case might be dismissed before it was ever heard. If your opponent was of higher status, the imbalance grew sharper. A patrician's testimony could outweigh yours, simply because of his standing. A magistrate might hear both sides, but his judgment would often lean toward the man who dined in the same halls, worshipped in the same temples, or sat on the same political committees. And if you were accused rather than accusing, the danger was worse. The presumption was not in your favor. The wealthy could produce witnesses, clients loyal to their patron, servants bound to obey, who would swear to whatever was needed. Your word alone was not enough to tip the scales. The punishments, too, were unequal. A noble might pay a fine for an offense that would see you flogged, branded, or sent to the mines. The lash fell harder on backs without titles. Exile was a sentence for the elite. For the poor, the sentence was often death. This wasn't an accident. It was the system doing exactly what it was built to do. Rome's laws kept the peace, yes, but they also kept the order. And in that order, people like you were expected to know your place, to accept your lot, and to understand that challenging the powerful was like walking into the arena without armor. The law was not your weapon, it was their wall. And without status, you stood on the outside, looking up at it, knowing it would not move for you. In Rome, punishment wasn't meant to be quiet. It was meant to be seen. For the poor and the powerless, justice wasn't just about correction. It was about spectacle, a reminder to everyone watching that the city's order was built on fear as much as it was on law. The most common punishment for petty crimes, petty in the eyes of the rich, but often desperate acts in yours, was flogging, a whip made of leather thongs, sometimes knotted with bits of bone or metal, would be brought down across your back in the public square. There was no privacy, no shield from the eyes of your neighbors. The crowd might jeer, or worse, simply watch in silence as the blows fell. It was as much about humiliation as it was about pain. For theft, branding was another favored penalty. A hot iron pressed against the skin, leaving a mark for all to see, often on the face or forehead. The burn didn't just scar the flesh, it followed you everywhere. Merchants would see it and refuse to trade with you. Employers would turn you away without a word. It was a permanent sentence, long after the punishment itself was over. The more serious the crime, or the more serious the accuser, the harsher the sentence. Public execution was not uncommon. Some were hanged in the forum, their bodies left for the birds as a warning. Others were thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, the sheer cliff overlooking the city, their fall as final as the judgment against them. And then there was the arena. For certain crimes, particularly those Rome wanted to make an example of, the condemned were sent into the Colosseum or other amphitheaters, not as gladiators, armed and trained, but as fodder. They might be chained to stakes and left for wild beasts, or forced to fight each other with crude weapons while the crowd roared. For the audience, it was entertainment. For you, it was the end. The brutality wasn't random. It was strategic. A punishment carried out in public, served as a warning to the hundreds, even thousands who witnessed it. It reminded the poor that order was maintained not through kindness, but through control. The wealthy were not immune to punishment, but theirs was different. A senator found guilty of a crime might be fined or exiled, sent to a comfortable villa in the countryside, rather than to the mines or the gallows. The law bent differently for them, sparing their dignity even in disgrace. For you, without status, there was no such leniency. Your punishment would be swift, visible, and unforgettable, not because Rome wanted justice, but because it wanted obedience. In ancient Rome, vanishing didn't always mean slipping away in the night. For someone without status, disappearing could happen in full daylight, with witnesses all around, and no one lifting a finger to stop it. Sometimes it began with debt, a bad run of work, an illness, a lost wager, and suddenly you owed more than you could repay. The wealthy creditor might send men to collect, and if you couldn't pay, you might be seized and sold into slavery. One morning you were walking to the market. By evening, you were bound for a villa in the countryside or a galley on the sea, your name already fading from the streets you once walked. Other times, it was the city's machinery of labor that swallowed you. The state was always in need of bodies for dangerous work. quarrying stone, digging canals, clearing sewers. If you were arrested for a petty crime, or even simply loitering without visible means of support, you could find yourself pressed into a work gang. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years, and when you were finally released, if you survived, your old home might no longer exist. And then there were the quiet disappearances that didn't involve official orders at all. A fight in a back alley that ended badly, a mugging gone wrong, a gang deciding you'd crossed them one too many times. In these cases, the Tiber was the final destination, its dark waters swallowing the evidence before dawn. The truth was, the city itself seemed to conspire in forgetting you. Your neighbors might remember you for a week, maybe two, but life in Rome was too crowded, too busy for one missing face to matter for long. The insulae filled their empty rooms quickly. The markets found new workers easily. You became another name not written down, another life unrecorded. For the elite, disappearance was a scandal, worthy of whispers, inquiries, perhaps even a Senate debate. For you, it was an inconvenience to others at most. Your absence was noted, then accepted, then gone, and perhaps that was the sharpest edge of living without status in Rome. Not the hunger, not the danger, not even the punishments, but the knowledge that you could vanish from this vast, roaring city, and it would not pause for you, not even for a heartbeat. When we imagine ancient Rome, it's easy to picture the marble shine, the sweep of the Forum, the shadow of the Colosseum, the echo of sandals on polished stone. But for most, Rome was not marble. It was brick and wood and dust. It was noise and smoke and the constant ache of living just far enough from power to see it but never touch it. Without status, the city was a test you took every day. The test was survival. You rose in cramped rooms that leaned with the weight of too many lives, carried water up narrow stairs, swallowed the dust of the streets, and bent your back to work that left your hands raw. You ate what you could find, not what you desired. You learned which corners to avoid after dark, which faces to greet in the morning, and which to avoid entirely. The law was not a shield for you. It was a wall, tall and smooth, impossible to climb. The punishments were not quiet corrections, but public performances meant to keep you in your place. And in a city of over 1 million souls, you could vanish without leaving more than a ripple in the air. And yet, within all that weight, there were still moments. The warm sweetness of a fig shared with a friend. The cool relief of fresh water on a hot afternoon. The brief comfort of laughter echoing through the alleys, reminding you that life, even here, was not only hardship. Ancient Rome could be beautiful. But beauty in Rome came with a price. And without status, that price was always higher. The city did not slow for you. It did not soften for you. It simply was. Vast, loud, hungry, and indifferent. So when we look back at it now, from the safe distance of centuries, it's worth remembering that the grandeur we admire was built on the backs of those whose names never made it into marble. And that for every senator, every poet, every general, there were thousands whose only monument was the life they managed to live, one day at a time. Perhaps that's why, if you were to find yourself there, stripped of rank, stripped of connections, just one among the countless many, you wouldn't last a day. Now, as you let this world fade, you can leave behind the creaking stairs, the narrow streets, the watchful eyes. Let the marble and the dust both dissolve into quiet. Breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift, far from the weight of the city, into a place where there is no status to lose, no walls to keep you out, and no need to vanish. Sleep well,